"Do you think I'm worth saving?" the shaking gunslinger asked the Lakota woman. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dry, dusty trail that led through the barren desert. The wind kicked up small clouds of dirt, and the only sound that broke the silence was the rhythmic clop of a horse's hooves on the hard-packed earth. The rider atop the horse was a man who seemed out of place in the desolate landscape. His name was John, and his once proud figure was now hunched in exhaustion, his shoulders sagging under the weight of years of regret and sorrow. John had been a gunslinger, known across the West for his quick draw and deadly aim. He had once walked into towns with his head held high, a swagger in his step, his hands steady and ready to take down anyone who dared cross him. People had feared him. He was the kind of man who could settle a dispute with a single shot. But now he had become a shadow of that man, a broken shell, wandering from place to place with nowhere to go. His hands, once firm and unwavering, now shook uncontrollably. It wasn't the cold or the heat that caused it. It was something deeper, a trembling that came from within, a sign of a man who had lost his way. The gun that once hung confidently at his side now felt heavy, a constant reminder of the violence he had caused, of the lives he had taken, and the ones he had ruined. John had no particular destination in mind. He was simply trying to outrun his thoughts, his memories. But no matter how far he rode, they always caught up with him. He could still hear the screams of men and women, the ones he had killed in cold blood, the ones whose faces he would never forget. They haunted him, and with each passing day, their voices grew louder in his mind, making the shaking in his hands worse. The desert was no stranger to him. He had traveled through it countless times during his days as a hired gun, chasing down bounties or doing the bidding of the powerful men who paid for his services. But today, it felt different. The heat of the sun burned his skin, and the dryness of the air seemed to seep into his very bones. Everything around him felt like a reminder of his failures. John had lost everything. His friends, his respect, his pride, everything had slipped through his fingers like sand. He had once been feared and admired, but now he was just a man with nothing to show for his life but a string of broken promises and lost opportunities. As the horse trotted along the trail, John's mind wandered back to the days before it all went wrong. He thought about the people he had loved, the people he had trusted, and the things he had lost along the way. There had been a woman once, a woman who had loved him despite the darkness in his soul. But he had pushed her away, afraid that she would see the monster he had become. She had left him, and he had never forgiven himself for it. He couldn't blame her, though. No one could love a man like him. A man who lived by the gun, a man who had taken lives without a second thought. A man who had no place in a world that valued peace over violence. John shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts from his mind. He didn't want to think about the past anymore. It only made the pain worse. He had to focus on the present, on the road ahead. But no matter how hard he tried, the memories kept coming back like ghosts in the wind. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light over the land. John could see the faint outline of a small village in the distance, nestled between the rolling hills. It was a quiet place, far from the chaos of the world. He had no reason to stop there, but something told him that it was the right thing to do. He urged his horse forward, the animal's hooves kicking up more dust as they neared the village. As he entered, he was greeted by curious eyes, eyes that had seen their fair share of outsiders, but none like him. The people in the village had an air of quiet resilience about them. They didn't speak much, but they watched him closely, their gazes full of suspicion. John didn't care. He was used to the stares, the whispers, and the avoidance. He had seen it all before. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to rest, to find some peace, even if it was only for a moment. He dismounted from his horse and tied it to a nearby post. His legs wobbled as he stood, the weight of his past pressing down on him. The shaking in his hands was getting worse, and he could feel the sweat trickling down his back. He had hoped that the desert heat would dry the cold sweat, but it didn't. As he walked into the village, he could feel the eyes on him. People moved aside to make room, but no one spoke to him. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it wasn't this. Maybe he had hoped for a chance at redemption, a chance to make amends for the things he had done. But the cold silence of the village only reminded him of how alone he truly was. He found a small building at the edge of the village, a modest home with a thatched roof. A woman stood outside, her hands busy with something, though John couldn't quite make out what it was. She was young, with long black hair that cascaded down her back like a waterfall. Her skin was tanned from the sun, and her eyes, though calm, held a depth that John couldn't quite place. She looked up as he approached, her gaze meeting his with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. John hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He had been a man of few words for so long, used to letting his actions speak for him. But now, with the weight of his regrets heavy on his shoulders, he didn't know how to start. I need a place to rest," he said finally, his voice raspy from days of silence. The woman studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing as if weighing something inside her. She seemed to sense the pain in his words, the desperation hidden beneath the rough exterior. "You can rest here," she said, nodding toward the small building behind her. "But only if you're willing to listen." John frowned. "Listen," he repeated, not sure what she meant. She nodded again, her expression unchanged. "The land here speaks to those who are willing to listen, and if you're willing to hear, it might just help you find what you're looking for." John stared at her, unsure of what she was offering, but something about her words resonated deep within him. He had heard the stories of the Lakota, of their deep connection to the land and the spirits that guided them. He had never put much stock in such things, but in his current state, he wasn't about to turn away any help that might come his way. He nodded slowly. "I'll listen." And with that simple agreement, his journey toward redemption began. John had never been one to believe in the power of the land or spirits. He had always relied on his own strength, his gun, and his wits to get by. But in the quiet of the Lakota village, things felt different. There was a peacefulness here that he couldn't quite explain, something that seemed to settle into his bones in a way nothing else ever had. The woman, Wee led him into her small home, which was simple but full of warmth. The fire crackled in the center of the room, casting a soft glow on the wooden walls. There was a faint scent of herbs and plants in the air, a smell that reminded him of the many places he had been, but this one felt more alive, more real. She gestured for him to sit, and John awkwardly lowered himself onto the mat, his legs sore from the long ride. The shaking in his hands hadn't stopped, but it had slowed just enough for him to hold the mug she handed him. It was filled with a strange, herbal tea, warm and comforting. He took a sip, the bitter taste surprising him, but he didn't complain. He needed something, anything, to help him forget the weight of his past. Wee didn't speak immediately. She just sat across from him, watching him quietly as though she was waiting for something. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, it was a relief. For the first time in years, John didn't feel the need to fill the silence with words. He just let it wash over him, letting it settle his restless mind. After a few moments, Wee spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, and somehow soothing, like the gentle rhythm of a lullaby. "You've been running for a long time, haven't you?" she asked, her eyes meeting his. John looked down at his hands, which were still trembling slightly, despite his best efforts to steady them. He had never liked talking about himself, especially not to a stranger. But there was something in her gaze, something in the way she looked at him without judgment, that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, it was okay to be vulnerable for once. "I guess I have," he replied quietly, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. "Been running from my past, from the things I've done." Wee nodded as though she understood. "You cannot outrun the past, John. It is always with you. The question is whether you will choose to face it." John swallowed hard, the words stinging. He knew she was right. He had been running for years, but the past always followed him, a shadow that couldn't be shaken off. Every town he went to, every person he met, reminded him of the things he had done, the lives he had ruined. No matter how far he traveled, he couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. "I don't know how to face it," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'm even worth saving." Wee didn't answer immediately. She simply reached over and placed a hand on his, the touch warm and comforting. It wasn't the touch of someone trying to fix him, but rather the touch of someone who understood the depth of his pain. Her fingers curled around his, and for a moment, John felt like he wasn't alone. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him from pulling away. "You are not beyond help," she said softly, "but you must first understand that healing is not something that happens overnight. It takes time, and it takes acceptance." John didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what to say. He had never been good at trusting people, especially people who didn't have anything to gain from his suffering. But Wee wasn't asking anything from him. She wasn't trying to fix him. She was simply offering him the chance to find peace. The days that followed were a blur of strange but calming rituals. Wee Yeye showed him how to breathe deeply, how to still his mind, how to reconnect with the earth beneath him. She taught him about the plants that grew in the area, explaining how they had healing properties, how they could help calm the mind and soothe the soul. John learned to make teas from the herbs, some to help with the shaking in his hands, others to ease the restless nights filled with nightmares. At first, John was skeptical. He didn't believe in these kinds of things. He had seen too much of the world to think that herbs and breathing exercises could fix anything. But as the days passed, he began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of calm. The tremors in his hands didn't stop entirely, but they became less frequent, less intense. His thoughts, which had been a jumbled mess of guilt and regret, began to slow down just enough for him to think clearly. Wee Yeye never pressured him to talk about his past. She didn't push him to confront his demons head-on. Instead, she simply let him be. She let him sit in silence, letting the quiet of the room and the peacefulness of the village settle into him. It was like a balm for his soul, soothing the raw, jagged edges that had been left by years of violence. As he spent more time in the village, John began to notice things he had never seen before. The way the wind rustled through the trees, the way the birds sang in the morning, the way the sun set behind the mountains, casting a golden light over everything. It was the simple beauty of life, something he had never paid attention to before. He had been too focused on survival, too focused on the next fight, the next job, the next kill. But here, in this quiet village, he was learning to slow down, to appreciate the moments of stillness. He began to realize that peace wasn't something that could be bought or earned. It was something that had to be found within oneself. And for the first time in a long time, John felt like he was getting closer to finding it. One evening, as the sun began to set, Wee Yeye invited him to sit by the fire. The flickering flames cast long shadows on the ground, and the air was cool, the heat of the day finally dissipating. They sat in silence for a while, the crackle of the fire the only sound between them. John felt the familiar tension in his chest, the gnawing feeling that he wasn't quite at peace, that something was still missing. But it was quieter now, softer, like a distant murmur rather than the roar it had been before. Wee Yeye spoke then, her voice calm and steady. "You cannot change the past, John, but you can choose what kind of man you are now." John looked at her, her face illuminated by the firelight, her expression soft but firm. He wanted to say something, to ask if he was really worth saving, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he simply nodded, unsure of what to say next. The path ahead was unclear, but for the first time in years he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could start walking it. The days in the Lakota village passed slowly, each one blending into the next. John found himself growing more comfortable with the rhythms of life here. He had learned to appreciate the small things, the sound of the wind in the trees, the smell of the wild sage that grew along the trails, the way the fire flickered in the evening. It was a world that had once been so foreign to him, but now it felt like a refuge, a place where the past didn't feel so close behind him. But no matter how much time he spent with Wee Yeye, no matter how much peace he found in the stillness of the land, the past still haunted him. It was always there, lurking in the corners of his mind like a shadow that refused to leave. At night, when the fire had burned low and the world outside had grown quiet, the memories would come flooding back. He could still see the faces of the men he had killed, the blood on his hands, the destruction he had caused. He had been a gunslinger for so long, a mercenary for hire, that he had forgotten what it meant to have a clear conscience. His past was a web of violence and betrayal, a trail of broken lives stretching back across the years. There were times when he could hardly remember who he had been before the gun had become his only companion, before the violence had consumed him. Wee Yeye had taught him how to breathe, how to still his mind, how to focus on the present. But no matter how much he tried to push the memories away, they always came back, like a flood that refused to be held back. He had tried to outrun them for years, but the truth was, there was no running from your own actions. The past followed you, no matter how far you traveled, no matter how hard you tried to forget. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Wee Yeye broke the silence that had settled between them. "You are carrying something heavy," she said softly, her eyes watching him carefully. John looked up at her, surprised. He had thought he had hidden the weight of his past well, but somehow she had seen right through him. He had never been good at hiding his emotions, especially not from someone like her, someone who seemed to understand things without words. "I've done things," he said, his voice rough. "Things I can't take back." Wee Ye didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at him as though she were waiting for him to continue. John took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He hadn't planned on telling her anything about his past. He had come here to escape it, to find some kind of peace. But the truth was, it was always with him, gnawing at the back of his mind. "I've killed," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "People. Innocent people. I've taken lives without thinking twice. It was all just a job to me. But now I can't stop thinking about what I've done." Wee Ye didn't look away from him. She didn't offer any words of comfort or reassurance. Instead, she simply nodded as though she understood. "You cannot change the past," she said quietly, "but you can choose to change how it shapes you." John's chest tightened at her words. It was something he had heard before, something people always said when they were trying to make him feel better. But this time, it felt different. There was something in the way she said it, something that made him realize that maybe, just maybe, it was true. He couldn't undo the things he had done, but he could choose what kind of man he wanted to be now. He looked into the fire, the flames dancing and crackling in the quiet night. He could feel the weight of his past pressing down on him, but somehow it didn't feel as heavy as it had before. Maybe it was the stillness of the village, the peace he had found here. Or maybe it was Wee Ye's words, her quiet understanding that made him feel like he wasn't completely alone. For the first time in a long time, John felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it was possible to change. Maybe it wasn't too late. The next few days passed in a blur. John spent most of his time working with Wee Ye, learning more about the herbs and plants that grew in the area, helping her gather them, and making more of the healing teas that had helped calm the shaking in his hands. But the memories of his past never went away completely. They were always there, lurking in the corners of his mind like a storm waiting to break. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, John found himself speaking again. It wasn't something he had planned, but the words just came out, like a dam breaking. "I used to be someone else," he said, his voice quiet. "Before the guns, before the killings, I was someone else. I had a family once. I had a life." Wee Ye didn't interrupt him. She simply sat there, listening. "I loved her," John continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I loved her more than anything, but I wasn't good enough for her. I couldn't change. I couldn't stop the violence. And in the end, I lost her. She left me." John closed his eyes, the memory of her face flashing in his mind. Her soft smile, the way her hair had blown in the wind, the way she had looked at him with so much love, so much hope. He had pushed her away, afraid that she would see the darkness in him, the violence he could never escape. And in the end, she had left, and he had been left with nothing but regret. "I ruined everything," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I ruined the one good thing in my life." Wee Ye didn't speak for a long time. She simply sat there, her hand resting gently on his. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft and steady. "You cannot change what has already happened," she said, "but you can choose to live differently now. The past will always be a part of you, but it does not have to define you." John looked at her, her calm eyes meeting his. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of clarity. The past was there, always would be, but it didn't have to control him. It didn't have to dictate who he was. He had a choice, and maybe, just maybe, he could make the right one. The next day, John went for a walk alone, something he hadn't done in weeks. He wandered through the village, his thoughts still heavy, but somehow lighter than before. He passed the small gardens where the villagers grew their food, the simple homes where families lived. It was a peaceful place, a place where people lived without the constant threat of violence. It was hard to imagine that he had once been a part of a world so different from this, a world where bloodshed was common, where people lived and died by the gun. As he walked, he came across a small creek, the water running clear and cold over the stones. He knelt beside it, his hands resting on the smooth rocks, and for the first time in years, he let the cool water wash over him, cleansing him, even if only for a moment. He wasn't sure what the future held. He wasn't sure if he could ever fully escape the ghosts of his past. But he knew one thing for sure: he was ready to try. He was ready to change. John's life in the village had settled into a quiet routine. The shaking in his hands had lessened, and his nights were no longer filled with the haunting nightmares that had once tormented him. He had started to find peace in the small things. The warm light of the sunrise, the soft hum of the wind through the trees, the simplicity of life that flowed gently around him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe again, free from the weight of his past. But peace, as he had come to learn, was fragile. It was not something that could be taken for granted, not something that could last forever. The world outside the village continued to turn, and John knew that sooner or later his past would catch up with him. He had been hoping for a second chance, a clean slate, but deep down, he knew that some things could never be erased. One day, as John was out in the fields, helping the villagers gather the last of the summer harvest, the peaceful routine was shattered. A group of men rode into the village, their horses kicking up dust as they approached. At first, John thought they might be traders or travelers passing through, but as they got closer, he saw their guns, holstered at their sides, ready for use. His heart sank. He recognized them immediately. They were bounty hunters, men who tracked down outlaws and criminals, bringing them in for the right price. John had crossed paths with men like them before, back in the days when he was a gunslinger, when his reputation had been enough to earn him a place on their list of targets. He knew what they were after, and he knew they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. As the group of bounty hunters dismounted and walked into the village, John stood still, his body tense. He could feel the weight of their gaze, the cold, calculating way they looked at him. They knew who he was, and they didn't care about the man he had become. They only cared about the reward that was waiting for them if they brought him in. Wei appeared at his side, her expression calm but alert. She knew what was happening before John even had a chance to speak. "John," she said quietly, her voice steady. "They're looking for you." John nodded, his jaw tightening. He had been expecting this day to come. His past, his former life as a gunslinger, had always been a part of him. No matter how far he ran, no matter how much he tried to change, there would always be someone looking for him, someone who remembered the name John. The bounty hunters approached, their leader stepping forward. He was a tall man with a grizzled face and a scar that ran down the side of his cheek, a constant reminder of the dangers of his line of work. "Well, well," the leader said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Look who we've found." The infamous gunslinger hiding out in a little village like a coward. John didn't flinch. He had heard worse over the years, and the words didn't cut as deep as they once did. He had been a part of that world, a world of violence and cruelty, but he was no longer that man. He had changed, he had to believe that he had. "I'm not who you think I am," John said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I've left that life behind." The leader chuckled darkly, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. "You can run, but you can't hide. We know who you are, and we've got a job to do. The reward has been posted for years, and it's still waiting for us." John's eyes flicked to the other bounty hunters who stood silently, watching him with cold, calculating eyes. They were professionals, men who didn't care about anything except the money they would earn when they brought him in. John could feel the weight of the decision before him. He could fight, take up his gun once more, and risk everything he had worked for, or he could surrender, face the consequences of his past, and trust in the village and its people. Wei hand touched his arm gently, grounding him. "You don't have to fight," she said softly. "There are other ways." John's heart raced as the words settled in his mind. He had spent his life running and fighting, but here, with Wei and the people of the village, he had learned a different way of life. A life that didn't revolve around violence, a life that didn't require him to pick up a gun. But the past had a way of pulling him back like a weight around his neck, dragging him down. The bounty hunter's voice broke through his thoughts. "You're coming with us, gunslinger. There's no other choice." John stood still, his mind racing. His past was staring him in the face, daring him to react, to give in to the old instincts that had defined him for so long. He had always relied on his gun, always used violence to solve his problems. But in that moment, John realized that he didn't want to be that man anymore. He didn't want to go back to the life he had left behind. He had found something here, something worth protecting, a life that was simple, peaceful, and free from the bloodshed that had once defined him. "I'm not going anywhere," John said firmly, his voice steady and resolute. "I've made my choice. I've changed." The bounty hunters looked at each other, surprised by his calm defiance. The leader stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just hide away here in this little village and pretend you're someone else? You're not fooling anyone. We know who you are." John didn't respond. He stood tall, facing the leader without flinching. He wasn't sure what would happen next. He knew that the bounty hunters wouldn't give up easily, but he also knew that he wasn't going to run anymore. He had found a new path, and he wasn't about to let his past define him. Wee Yea stepped forward, her presence calm but powerful. "You will leave him in peace," she said, her voice unwavering. "This village has no place for violence. If you want to take him, you will have to do so by force. But know this, if you harm him or anyone here, you will not leave." The bounty hunters looked at her, surprised by her boldness. They hadn't expected resistance, not from a village like this. The leader hesitated, but the lure of the reward was too strong. He turned to his men and nodded. "You heard her," he said. "We'll take him by force if we have to." But just as they made a move, the villagers appeared, stepping out from behind the buildings, their faces resolute and determined. They had gathered to protect their own, to stand together in the face of violence. John realized then that he wasn't alone, not anymore. He had people who cared about him, people who believed in the man he was becoming, not the one he had been. The bounty hunters paused, their eyes flicking nervously between the villagers and John. The tension in the air was thick, but there was a sense of unity among the villagers that couldn't be ignored. In that moment, John knew that he had found something far more powerful than any weapon he had ever carried. He had found a community, a place where he could belong, a place where he could finally be free of the ghosts of his past. The leader of the bounty hunters finally spoke, his voice full of frustration. "This isn't over," he said, his tone sharp. "We'll be back." John nodded, his resolve unwavering. "Then we'll be ready." As the bounty hunters rode away, John stood tall, surrounded by the villagers who had protected him. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging. His past might have come looking for him, but he had chosen a different path. A path of strength, not in violence, but in community and in the courage to face whatever came next. The days following the confrontation with the bounty hunters were quiet, but the air was thick with anticipation. John knew that the threat hadn't fully passed. The bounty hunters would not give up easily. They were men who had been trained to track and capture, to chase down those who tried to hide from their pasts. But something had changed within John. He had chosen a different path, one where he was no longer running, no longer looking over his shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up with him. The village, once just a refuge, had become something more, his home. The people here, the simple, kind-hearted souls who had accepted him, had shown him a strength he had never known before. It wasn't the strength of a gunfighter or the strength of a warrior. It was the strength of community, of people coming together to protect each other, to stand firm in the face of fear. And in that strength, John found the courage to face the hardest choice of all, to surrender his past. Wee Yea had helped him understand this. She had never told him what to do. She had never tried to change him or force him into a mold. But she had given him the tools to heal, to see his life from a different perspective. She had shown him that redemption wasn't something that could be earned through action alone. It was something that came from within, something that required self-acceptance, a willingness to change, and the courage to face the consequences of the past. One morning, as John walked through the village, the weight of the past seemed lighter than it had ever been. The sun was rising over the hills, casting a warm, golden glow over the land. He stopped for a moment to watch the light spill over the fields, the quiet hum of the world waking up around him. He had once believed that peace was a fleeting thing, something only the lucky or the naive could ever hope to hold. But now, standing in the heart of the village, he realized that peace wasn't something that could be found. It was something that had to be made. The villagers had begun to welcome him more openly, treating him not as the outlaw he had once been, but as the man he was now trying to become. They saw past his rough exterior, past the scars and the pain that he carried, and accepted him for who he was in this moment, not for who he had been. It was a kindness he had never known, a kind of forgiveness that didn't ask for anything in return. It was humbling. But there was still the matter of the bounty hunters. John knew they wouldn't stop until they had him, until they had claimed the reward that had been posted for him years ago. They had shown him no mercy, and he couldn't expect any. They would come back, he was sure of it. The only question was when. One afternoon, as John sat with Wee Yea by the fire, she spoke again, her voice as calm and steady as ever. "You know they will come back," she said, her eyes fixed on the flames. "But they do not control your fate, you do." John had thought about that a lot in the days following the bounty hunter's visit. He had always believed that his fate was tied to the decisions others made about him. The lawmen, the bounty hunters, the men who had hired him for jobs, his entire life had been defined by the choices of others. But Wee had helped him see that his true power lay in the choices he made now, not in the past. He could decide what kind of man he wanted to be, and it was that decision that would determine his future. "I don't want to fight anymore," John said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "I've fought all my life, but I'm tired of running. I'm tired of being the man they think I am." Wee looked at him, her gaze steady and reassuring. "You are not who you were," she said simply, "and you don't have to be who they expect you to be. You are who you choose to be now." John nodded, a sense of resolve settling in his chest. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he couldn't keep running from it. It was time to face what was coming, whatever that might be. The next day, John went to the village elders, the wise men and women who had lived in the area for years, who had seen the seasons change and the people grow. He asked them if they would stand with him, if they would protect the village from the bounty hunters who would no doubt return. They had already shown him their strength, their unity, and he knew that if he was to face this challenge, he would need their support. The elders didn't hesitate. They had come to respect John not for his past, but for the man he had become in their village. They saw that he had chosen to change, that he was ready to leave behind the life of violence he had known, and they understood that this decision was not one that could be easily made. They stood with him, as they would stand with any member of their community. "We are strong together," the elder woman said, her voice firm. "You are not alone." John felt a deep sense of gratitude in that moment, a sense of belonging that he hadn't felt in years. He had never had a family of his own, never had a place where he truly felt he could be himself. But now, in this village, he had found that. The bounty hunters came back a few days later, just as John had expected. This time, they came with more men, more guns, more resolve. They didn't care about the village, about the people here. All they cared about was getting John and collecting the reward. But they didn't count on the strength of the village. As they rode in, ready to claim their prize, they were met with a united front. The villagers stood together, men and women alike, all of them ready to protect their own. There was no violence, no fighting, just a quiet strength, an unwavering resolve that spoke louder than any gunshot ever could. The leader of the bounty hunters, a man who had been so sure of his victory, stopped in his tracks when he saw the unity of the village. He had expected to find a broken man, a man who would run or fight back in desperation. But what he found instead was a community that would not be intimidated. The villagers didn't raise their weapons. They didn't threaten or shout. They simply stood there, shoulder to shoulder, unwavering. John stepped forward, his heart steady. The bounty hunters were watching him, waiting for him to make a move. He took a deep breath and faced them, not with fear, but with calm resolution. "I won't be going with you," he said simply. "You won't find what you're looking for here." The bounty hunters hesitated, their eyes flicking between John and the villagers. They had come for him expecting a fight, but they were not prepared for the unity and strength they saw before them. The leader of the bounty hunters scowled, his hand twitching toward his gun. But after a long, tense moment, he seemed to realize that there was no point in continuing. With a sharp motion, he turned his horse and rode away, signaling for the others to follow. John stood there watching them leave, his chest tight but his heart lighter than it had been in years. He had faced his past, and he had chosen a different path, not one of violence, but one of peace, one of strength through community. The villagers cheered, their faces shining with pride. They had protected their own, stood together against the outside world, and won not through force, but through unity. And in that moment, John knew that he had finally found what he had been searching for all along. A place where he belonged, a place where he could build a new life, free from the ghosts of the past. As the days went by, John began to see the world differently. He no longer saw it as a place of danger and violence, but as a place full of possibility, a place where he could make a real difference. He had found his redemption, not in erasing his past, but in choosing to live differently, to be the man he had always had the potential to be. And so John's journey continued, not as a gunslinger, but as a man who had found peace, who had found redemption, and who had finally learned what it meant to truly live.